Good afternoon. I know all of us had lunch, so this is sleepy time, but I'll try. I thought of this topic because I was given a choice by the moderator to choose any topic, and I thought maybe I should talk about the unique and peculiar dynamics of alliances with more than two partners. That means not dyadic, but multi-partner. And therein lies a tale, because the nature of alliance functioning changes drastically in conceptual terms as soon as you have more than two partners. So it's not an extension of two, from two to three or four or something like that. It's a totally different world. So I'll try to make that case, and the complexities that go with it, and the conflicts and the problems of managing such multi-partner alliances. So that's the topic briefly. Let me start by pointing out how these are uniquely different. I'll talk about that, I just mentioned. Central role of social exchange, which is why the multi-partner alliances function quite differently than two-partner alliances. In particular, I'll talk about reciprocity, which is, or generalized reciprocity, and the role of social exchange, and trust. That means you need more trust whenever you have multi-partner alliances. And briefly touch on major types of such multi-partner alliances and some key issues for the future. These are the rationale. I don't want to spend time over here, but all of us know what these alliances are all about. Basically, we can remember the term partnerships. It's not quite that, but if you think of partnerships, you can think of the marriage model of husband and wife. Many of the concepts that I'll be speaking of have been applied to marriage models and other alliances which are multi-partner, like NATO and so on. Market access, that is, if you go personally into a different country, the risks are quite a bit. The hurdles are a lot to access that market. So best is easiest, and that's been going on, is to have a partner who's from that other country where you want to go. These are sort of common sense motivations for alliancing. Market access and then scale economies, risk sharing, that is, instead of you yourself, a firm, sharing all the risks, you share it with others. And so it's a micro level thing compared to what we had, the discussions we had before the lunchtime, which had to do with countries and nations and so on. And I'll try to link up with that macro idea a little bit later. Cost sharing, same thing. You don't bear all the costs. And learning, that means you try to learn from the partner, not legally always, but that used to happen. And the danger of that happening always remains in any alliance. And I have to include the term colluding. It is not legitimate, not legal, illegal, but that goes on sometimes. So that is one of the motivations. And people have been caught and jailed for doing that. Different forms of alliances. There are two basic forms, which is one is where there is a contract and there's an equity participation, and then there are others where there is no such participation. So again, I don't want to go into all these things in the interest of time. But you see, if you have just contracts, written or otherwise, without any investment or equity, That's a different kind of animal than if you actually invest, one of both partners invest some equity in the joint enterprise called the alliance. And when you form a third, that is, if there's partner A and partner B, and you form a third entity, legal entity, that's called a joint venture. It continues to be a joint venture with two parents. Therein lies all these uniqueness questions that I mentioned. So it's quite different from a single organization or a formal organization, which is why people have been known to mix up M&A literature with alliance literature. The two cannot exist together. Maybe I'll come back to that later on. I'm trying to figure out, this is another slide, again, because it was originally supposed to be a 25-minute presentation. It became 15, so I will stick with that. I did have another slide to talk about M&A. M&A, if A and B, two firms, merge, both firms go out of existence. It becomes a third entity, which may be called A plus B, C, anything. But A vanishes, B vanishes, legal entities. So it still becomes one single organization. There's a unified chain of command. In alliances, no such thing is there. You've got to persuade the partner to go along. There is no command structure that any one partner firm can dictate to others, which you can do in a single organization or what's called a hierarchy. So in an acquisition situation, A acquires B. B goes out of existence. A remains as A. So it's very important to understand the difference between the M&A literature and the alliance, different kind of entity. The two cannot coexist, although they are related. It's just life and death, night and day. They're related, but they don't coexist. It's important to appreciate that so that we can appreciate all the complexities, particularly managerially speaking, of multi-partner alliances. So business alliances are inter-firm, which is between firms. Cooperative arrangements pursuing a mutual strategic objectives. That means the objectives of, if there are two or three, all three firms' mutual objectives have to be mutually agreed upon. Nobody's forcing anybody to form an alliance. It has to be voluntary, and there are pros and cons of that. Nevertheless, you form a multi-partner alliance or even a dyadic alliance only when both parties or all parties agree that their objectives are potentially fully met or almost fully. Then you go into the alliance. Multi-partner alliances are alliances formed by at least three partner firms. These are growing, and that's why I thought I'll have occasion to share with you my thoughts on this. Because the complexity of goods and services, global economy, and cross-linking of industries by new technologies, which means across three countries, as in this workshop, 3 countries or more. As the number of exchange parties reaches 3, social exchanges become generalized, and I'll talk about that. And hence the problem of managing such multi-partner alliances becomes much more complex than managing a two-partner alliance. Suppose that you have some kind of 3 firms in 3 countries, because this is a workshop about Japan, India, US. So you can switch around the functions. This is just an illustration, folks. So suppose something is designed, or some R&D is done, some innovation by a firm in Japan, which can link up, form partnership with, and have some gadget or widget manufactured in India, and then marketing firm in the US. you can form a partnership of that type, multi-party. And the solid arrows show direct influence. The dashed arrows show some kind of feedback, positive, negative feedback as well as positive. I'm quite taken with the, as an aside, I'm taken with the idea of positive feedback. I remember the works of Magoro Maruyama, who talked about the second cybernetics. That means if you give positive feedback, it blows up, increases, etc., whatever the behavior. Interpartner cooperation, 3 factors are needed for that. One is perspective of focal form. It's important to understand nothing in the alliance literature is from a consultant or from God's view. It is from your view. You are one firm trying to form another, interact or get the cooperation of another firm who is out to get you. Why do I say that? Because if there are 3 firms cooperating in a multi-partner alliance, or even 2, they remain potential competitors. This is what is not understood by a lot of people. It is not an M&A situation. They remain competitors, which means the chances of opportunistic behavior are always there in regard against that by deterrence mechanisms, monitoring, and all that. So you can trust, but never trust fully. We're talking firms. We're not talking people. So dependence is the focal firm. So focal firm is the perspective of the firm that you're talking about. The other is the partner. So focal firm, dependence is the focal firm on its partner. If you're not dependent, there's no rationale or even thought of alliance. It's because you want resources that you do not have yourself. That is why you ask for the cooperation and get the resources of another firm. The moment you do that, you become dependent. It's important to realize that in some ways, simple or complex. And there is a risk that is generated, which I have called a relational risk in a paper in '96. That is beyond the usual business risk that is talked about in the literature. So interpartner cooperation is the aim, is the willingness of an alliance firm to engage with its partner in both resource cooperation and relational cooperation to pursue mutually compatible interests in the alliance. Again, mutually compatible interests, not the same interest as in the marriage situation. People should not assume, as people know for a fact from their personal experience, the interest and the objectives of the wife usually is different from the husband. You've got to stop and think about it. But they can coordinate and they're compatible. If they're not compatible, then things go awry, which is why we have the literature is called marriage and divorce literature, by the way, 50% and all that. The goal of interpartner cooperation is primarily to develop confidence in partner cooperation. That means a firm's perception that the partner will be cooperative, has the confidence, so to develop that. Interdependence, again, a key exchange condition is the interdependence among firms that is created by the scarcity of resources, which is why the original rationale of alliancing in the first place, because you don't go into an alliance unless you have to, because you could share the, what's called in economics, residuals, profits and so on. You've got to share. So if you can do it alone, you should go it alone. It's when you cannot, that's when you think of an alliance. Business alliances are more likely to be formed when there's a high degree of interdependence among firms. That is, when member firms are vertically linked, are in the same industry, and belong to the same strategic group. We did not go into discussion of this, but there's a lot of literature on that. The other factor is power dependence. Power dependence suggests that when A needs resources from B, A develops a dependence on B, and consequently B acquires power over A. These are kind of given things, unavoidable things. So more power means more ability to influence the other party. Always the other party, because you've got to manage the whole alliance, which means all the other parties in a multi-partner alliance. Social exchange. This is a new concept that becomes relevant in multi-partner alliances, not very relevant in dyadic alliances, because the notion of reciprocity, to which I will go in a second. Social exchanges are voluntary actions of individuals that are motivated by the returns they are expected to bring and typically, in fact, bring from others. This is from Blau's Power in Social Life. It's from sociology. But let me just speed up the presentation by saying that social exchanges are voluntary, and therefore it differs from economic exchanges. It's both voluntary, it is informal, there's no necessarily a written contract and so on, which is necessary for economic exchanges, and more uncertain than economic exchange. And the uncertainty is because of the notion of reciprocity that we'll get to in a second. So two components are particularly important in social exchange process: trust and power dependence. I've talked about power dependence. Trust, I've decided to skip a lot of slides on that. We generally understand what it is. Why is social exchange important in alliances? Most alliance agreements represent incomplete contracts that do not specify every detail of the relationship. This is the life. All contracts are incomplete. We need to absorb these notions, which goes against kind of common sense. But what will happen in the future, nobody can really fully understand or divine about the future. So all contracts are incomplete. But you drop contracts or contractual provisions in such a way that you anticipate most of the important ones, and then you assume a certain level of flexibility on the part of the partner's actions. So because alliances are an ongoing process, exchanges in alliances have to take place over time rather than all at once. This is a given too. Cooperative behavior in alliances is often reciprocal and contingent upon positive and reinforcing behavior of the other party. So let me just explain. If somebody does a favor, A does a favor to B in a direct reciprocity situation, B is not only obligated to return the favor to A, but everybody's watching. A is watching whether the favor is returned or not. Okay? In a multi-partner situation, this changes. A gives a favor, does a favor to B. This is where the generalized reciprocity notions come. When it's three partners, A will assume that B will do the favor. It's like paid forward. The movies and so on about paying forward. So B will do something to C, and then C in turn will give the benefit back to A. So A might get it after some time. If it is only three, it's after two loops. So that's why you have to have more trust than a dyadic situation, where you can control directly whether the partner is playing by the rules, is giving the benefit back or not, and then decide to continue or discontinue. In a generalized reciprocity, you've got to depend on some others doing their right thing and you getting the benefit back. So that's the notion of reciprocity. Cooperative behavior is met with cooperative response that reinforces the positive pattern of exchange. Reciprocity generates trust through regular discharge of obligations and expansion of the domains of exchange. So trust development depends on that. I'll move on. Generalized reciprocity happens within a group of at least three parties, and there is no direct reciprocity among them. What A receives from B is not contingent on what A gives to B. Thus, A gives to B, B to C, and then C to A. Often, A does not have the information about reciprocity between B and C. May happen, may not happen, so a lot of uncertainty is there. So you've got to trust the other partners to do the right thing. So free riding is possible. Two types of generalized reciprocity. One is A provides resources to partner B, B to C, and then to A. That's the chain. It's like a chain. It's easy to understand. In a net generalized reciprocity, individual partners contribute to the group as a whole, and then they derive benefits directly from the group. Thus, individual partners exchange with the group as a whole, not with other partners. How much time do I have? 5? We started late at 10, so I'm almost done. Both types of chain and net can be found in reciprocity. So these are the 4 types of multi-partner analysis. So I'll just take a minute to explain. So on the y-axis you see chain and net, 2 types, and the exchange horizon is how long you're going to keep the relationship going, from short to long. So there are 4 types, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. Let me just say product bundling, where 3 partners get together and have a product, bundle product, and each of them are free, according to the contract, to make money by selling the kind of product that they have decided. Joint bidding, you see that in construction projects, because any one construction company does not, usually, big projects, have either the money or the expertise to carry it through. So they typically, the bidding, when they put up some kind of bid, they join together. Again, the contract specifies who will do what and how the revenues will be shared. Horizontal tailored suits.
Some time for questions.
Time up, almost. Okay.
No, he's showing 0 minutes for some.
And the last one is R&D consortia. You can figure out the dimensions there. Managerial complexities different from traditional managing, which is hierarchical chain of command, and significant aspects of multi-partner analysis that are different from single firms. So I've talked about only a little about trust and so on, but there are papers on my website relating to each of these constructs. I've written about resource, risk, trust, control, opportunism, cooperation, harmony, commitment, forbearance, governance structure, like equity and non-equity, learning, legitimacy, social exchange, stability. They fail. Alliances fail a lot. Within 3 years, like 50% fail. Development stages, co-evolution, partner analysis, culture, internal tensions. There are dialectical tensions between partners, alliance horizon, and so on. So what are the issues? In research, how do you research this process? There's not much research yet. And managing, developing inter-partner trust within such multi-partner alliances is a difficult task. So I'm just saying these are the critical issues. I'm done with it.
I think we go on to the next presentation, and then we'll have, at the end of the session, we'll have questions. Like, yeah, Michael.
I had another slide, which is missing.
Of course, it would reflect
Oh, USD is good. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to take a question while
Yeah.
it's going to take a minute.
Okay.
Rather than- If you want to ask a question.
Yeah. Any question for Professor Das? Because he's going to take some time. Yeah.
Won't work for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that, because India, US, Japan, they three different cultural background countries. And my first question is that any concrete good example of cooperation, alliance of these three countries? Because I'm not so familiar with this.
Yeah, you had that manufacturing versus marketing and that, so you can deal with it. Can give a specific example actually. Manufacturing, marketing, and R&D.
No, first it starts with R&D, product development, something, an idea or patent. And then the question of implementation, which is the manufacturing part. And usually that is done by a different firm. All I'm saying is, as an example, that is for a different country. And then the third is the after the product is manufactured and so on, you got to sell it and market it and so on. So that can be a third firm, which has expertise in that. So this is kind of typical. And then there's feedback and so on. You draw up a contract, who will do what, time frames and all.
No, I think what he wants to know is very specific example. So if I can say, for example, we can think of say generic drugs manufactured in India. USA has FDA regulation, Japan has another regulation. So they should put together these two regulations, see whether there can be an alliance of these two regulations and whether the generic drugs can come from India to both these countries, and that will be the tripod alliances. But that requires R&D alignment, the institutional alignment among all these levels, India, Japan, and USA.
Yeah, that could be interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gautam. I'm Michael Santoro, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Vice President Mori, Dean Kobayashi, Gautam for this very nice invitation, and especially because Gautam was kind enough to allow me to speak about a very new topic of research and something, so I will warn the audience in advance that this is something that Gautam and I started talking about a few months ago, and that is still sort of a very new idea and set of thoughts for me. And I thought, I was reading at the time the new book about Steve Jobs that came out in the fall, and I was very struck as I read it that Steve Jobs was a man who was influenced very deeply by his contacts with both Japan and with India. And so I thought, well, maybe this is a good opportunity, this conference, to start to think about that and what that might mean. What did it mean that he was a man that really had extremely deep ties with religion in India, with the geography and space of Japan and the ideas of Japan. And sort of you begin by the thing we're trying to explain, which is, what I'm calling like the Apple connection. What is it that makes Apple so successful, a company, its products so successful? It's more than just the fact that it functions well and it has a good operating system. It has that too, but there's a personal kind of connection that Apple users have to their devices, and in a sense that's kind of what I'm trying to explain. And I guess if you look at this from a diagrammatic point of view, what I'm in essence trying to argue or explore is that in fact there were three principal influences that went into this product. The first, most obviously, is that Steve Jobs, was a product of Silicon Valley, and it's an American company, and that I don't think that we worry too much about Apple being an American company, a U.S. company with deep roots in a particular part of the world, which is known for its technological creativity, Silicon Valley, but also I think there are Japanese influences in the apple and Indian influences in the apple, and I will try to sort of explain in what sense I mean this. For the professors in the crowd, of course, this is all very easy, but you're all asking, well, what are those arrows? Like, what exactly? We know what we're trying to explain. We know the dependent variable, like the apple, but what exactly are these independent variables? These three independent variables, and what exactly is that arrow? What is that relationship, that theoretical relationship? Just to forewarn everyone, in the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to actually answer those questions, but hopefully it will help in our discussion to help to formulate some theories along those lines. There's many candidates, if you will, for thinking about the relationship of culture and capitalism, and I've sort of randomly picked a few that seem relevant. There's Annalise Saxenian's work on Silicon Valley immigrant entrepreneurs is very interesting. She's written about Indian and Chinese entrepreneurs and how important they are in Silicon Valley. And then, recently we've heard C.K. Prahalad, Ram Charan, Vijay Govindarajan have all been spokespeople, if you will, over the past decade for the concept of karma capitalism, the idea that there's another form of capitalism based on principles of Indian religion. Randy Commissar, lecturer at Stanford, has written about Zen capitalism and and lectures quite a bit to Silicon Valley people. A little closer, these are very interesting theories and streams of academic research. A little closer to what I have in mind is the work of Mohanbir Sawani, who discusses the relevance of the Bhagavad Gita to business. He says, he's a marketing professor, and he says, the Western model, the rational Western model, depends on the idea of conquering the customer, whereas the principles of the Bhagavad Gita, Professor Sawani says, teach a more symbiotic relationship with the customer. Of course, the idea of cultures borrowing from one another is something that we understand perfectly well in art. This is Demoiselle d'Avignon by Picasso, one of the iconic figures. I mean, this is, maybe the most famous and most important painting of the 21st century. The beginnings of Cubism, the beginnings of Impressionism. I mean, this is the end of an entire period of Western art and the birth and beginning of modern abstract expressionism. It's an extraordinarily important painting hanging in the Museum of Modern Art. And interestingly enough, and this is a picture of Picasso, I guess caught red-handed, I would say, this picture is, because it's 1907, the same year that he painted Demoiselle d'Avignon. And until very late in his life, for some reason, he denied the influence of African art on him. And it's so obvious, it was obvious to people at the time, the mask, the two figures on the right, as you can see, kind of obviously figures that are drawn from the African mask tradition. So, but, we go, and even more kind of poignant in terms of our own discussion is the art of the ukiyo artist Hiroshiga, late 19th century Japanese artist whom Van Gogh copied. He owned a number of his prints. Hiroshiga was the last in the practitioners of the ukiyo tradition, which paints, which through wood cuts sort of paints a kind of a floating, it's translated in the West as sort of floating landscapes. And you could see that Van Gogh, the picture on the right is by Van Gogh. I mean, it's literally, he took a painting that he liked by Hiroshiga and he just copied it. Well, he didn't just, Hiroshiga himself, this quote is a little out of context. This is one of the things he said at his death. He says, I leave my brush in the east and set forth on my journey. I shall see the famous places in the western land. Well, he only actually meant the west of Japan, but so I'm taking the quotation a little out of context. But you can see. I mean, these are. This is he was Van Gogh. The picture that Van Gogh painted was from 100 famous views of Edo, the old name for Japan, and these two paintings I just kind of picked out randomly. These are of course Van Gogh's famous irises and Hiroshige's view of Fuji, and I think you can see that when Van Gogh copied, something was left within him. It imbued his genius as an artist and informed what has become in the West an extremely iconic visual image and form of art. Again, sort of, stepping backwards a bit, I think I'm not going to talk so much about the influence of Silicon Valley on Jobs because, these are all of the companies that were there, and, he was a child of Silicon Valley. Jobs grew up, he would bounce around, he worked at Atari, he would bounce around all of these companies, he studied at the foot of Packard, of Hewlett-Packard, so the influence of Silicon Valley on Apple products, I think, is quite obvious, and probably we needn't say too much about that, but less, more subtle, but just as palpable, I think, though, are the influences that come from Japan and India. And these are two companies, Sony and Toyota. Sony, Jobs was very much a student of, and I deliberately took the I deliberately take a package showed the Walkman in its original packaging because when Jobs was growing up in California, Sony had an office there, and he would regularly visit the office. And he didn't just, of course he loved the products because the Sony products were beautiful and pleasing to consumers, but he also would always pick up the brochures too. He liked the packaging as well. And the Toyota, I think, Toyota's a very interesting company because those of you that are old enough to have lived in America through that period of time, people sort of thought, well, what is it? The Japanese, they're just making things cheaper than we are. But in fact, as you can see by this, 1975 Toyota design, it was meant to be pleasing. The Japanese manufacturers were keenly aware of the fact that they were producing for foreign markets, and their design was not only beautiful in itself, but sought to communicate and make a connection with consumers, something that Sony products obviously did in a very deep way. And so this is something I think that, an important sort of aspect of an Apple computer is that sense of being pleasing to the customer. Jobs also visited early on India, and he said when he came late in his life, he said the people in the Indian countryside, he said, don't use their intellect like we do. They use their intuition instead, and their intuition is far more developed than in the rest of the world. Intuition, he says, is a very powerful thing, more powerful than intellect, in my opinion. That's had a big impact on my work, he said, the power of intuition and experiential vision. And so he, here's Jobs late in his life holding, the iPad, and clearly, as you look at the iPad, you could see design elements from Japan, the Zen idea that something is defined as much by what it is not as what it is. And so he said maybe that's the reason my religiosity, he said, is the reason I don't like to have on-off buttons on my devices. And again, sort of that sense of embracing the customer. Jobs himself was a very, if you read his biography, he was a very difficult man in many ways. But he knew how, he understood people. He had a sympathy for people and an intuition of the things that were meaningful for them. And so I think, sort of to close, I want to just say a few words about art and design, particularism, and universality. All of our, this is of course Shiva, the god who brings everything together in the universe through motion, and of course the picture of a Japanese gate, usually leading to a Shinto temple, although not clear where it's leading in this link here. And these are, in some ways, these are very particular objects. Art can be very particular, design can be very particular, and yet it also has, within every piece of particular art, and in every particular idea, there is the quest for universality. And it was Jobs's, I think, openness as a person. He grew up a child, as I am, of the 70s. It was his openness to these foreign cultures and his willingness to embrace them and employ them in his thinking and his reasoning, which clearly led him to become the design genius that he is. And so, I think, probably people will remember Steve Jobs 100 years from now. He will still be a name that the historians will write about. And it may be that what they will understand about him is that in some ways he was a very forward-thinking person in the sense of his ability to not just be bound by the particular country and culture in which he grew up in, powerful and enticing though Silicon Valley is, but drew strength and creativity from embracing other cultures, specifically in his case, those of Japan and of India. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Question. I think we cannot wait. This is exciting. Question, comments. It's very interesting. Yeah. I'm sure. Yes.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Patrick R. And I've just been taking notes here with my MacBook. But I think it's a very interesting topic you brought up because as someone who has grown up in this sort of new generation, in my household, we sort of, my parents have kind of done that whole embracing thing. You can see statues of Shiva, Ganesha all over the place, which is probably a different recognition of those figures in India, but I think it shows the whole concept of Westernization trying to embrace these new outlooks of intuition and like trying to have these new cultural trends. And I think I guess my question is like, where can you see this in other companies other than Apple, where people are looking at saw what Steve Jobs did in embracing these different cultures and trying to address that to the new settings and globalization stuff.
Yeah, I did say I was new to this subject, right? Yeah, I think as I tried to express earlier with the various consultants that are, the Bhagavad Gita, people are applying the Bhagavad Gita to management principles. So it is happening at different companies in different ways. I can't say that I've done a study of it, but I think you're right. The point of your question is right. It's not just Steve Jobs, but it's part of a more general trend.
Yes.
Yes. If I can answer for a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a company in Massachusetts where I lived in the Northeast called Shiva. And the company embraced the idea, it's a tech company, ICT, of creative destruction, which is Shiva's notion. He maintains and destroys. And out of that has come the literature on something that Professor Kobayashi might have mentioned, at least I thought he did, on the dialectics of creation, in which you have disruptive capitalism. And they're calling it in order for capitalism to push forward, you have to disrupt and break old models and create new models, and that is the whole mythology of Shiva. And they call the company, it's not an Indian company, and they call it Shiva. So that's one example that came to mind.
Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Jazami.
Thank you. I too would like to thank the organizers of this workshop and forum, and I'm a bit of an outlier here. I think Gotham invited me to be the stochastic fluctuation in the day. Extra points if you can recognize what this painting of what this is and who the painter is. What's
Spanish Armada?
No, actually this is the 3 Days Fight by Vermeer. I'm going to step back a little bit. I'm a geographer and a spatial statistician, and I study probabilistic political economy, and I'm going to look at the largest possible scale, which is the world economy. Because when this was first proposed to me, what I was interested in is how does a specific alliance affect the structure of a global interconnected economy, and how does that economy also impact the constraints on the success or failure of that possible alliance. So what I'm going to do is really raise a few questions. I'm going to provide a bit of systemic context. I'm going to just very briefly examine a structure of growth and change, and with a particular emphasis on measurement. And that's something that we haven't mentioned yet today, but if such an alliance takes place, how do we measure its success? How do we evaluate if, and what criterion do we use to measure if this alliance is successful? And what comes to mind is something like convergence initially. And that's actually a very adaptive comment. I'm going to place all this, all of my talk in the context of an integrated global system. This is inspired by World Systems. World Systems was originally promoted by Emanuel Wallerstein in 1974, but it's actually gone through tremendous changes in the last almost 40 years since the publication of his book. And I'm going to then talk about some means of measurement, not only of potential affiliations, but how these structural changes take place within the last 50 years, how they can impact this kind of alliance. So I'm going to start by mentioning just that I want to talk about we're going to take a probabilistic political economy approach. There are difficulties with interconnectivity, partly because we create dependent structures. Those dependent structures in terms of measurement can't be measured using traditional, say, neoclassical statistical approaches, because all of a sudden we're creating a covariant structure. And also we have to evaluate process through time, so we are concerned with turbulence or the stability of the system. And so it becomes very necessary to see if the system has been stationary or steady over time, so we need to be able to examine that as well. I also want to mention compensatory state level policy trajectories and how these impact a concept that has evolved fairly recently called maneuver. And this is a concept that has not only confined to, say, world systems and sociology, but also international relations, and how we can actually, when we're measuring change, we're actually measuring maneuver, and we can actually think of affiliation as one kind of maneuver, a choice of policy to try to enhance position in this global economy. Just very quickly, we can structure a global economy as a hierarchy, and I'm going to go through these very quickly. Just the characteristics within the hierarchy. These are not simple assignments as the old UN classification. These are based more recently on very rigorous statistical cross-country comparisons, what we consider core and periphery. And so when we examine this hierarchy, actually we treat the global economy as both anarchic and hierarchical. There are states that are more favored based on resource endowment, relative position on the surface of the planet, as well as specific choices that have been made. But basically, we look at the world as a system of states. And states can represent different fragments of global capitalism, of an integrated global economy, but they differ in their politics. In this way, we're looking at something that differs from the old static Rostov type approach where we assume that all countries in development go through essentially the same stages. We actually see every country as uniquely maneuverable and creating and has a unique endowment, so we need to treat one individually. When we do this, we have to model this as a one-to-many relationship between the world economy and these various countries, and we see countries, not only capitalist entities and actors competing, but countries also competing for maneuver for the largest share of a pie. Unfortunately or fortunately, at any particular time, we see the global economy as a zero-sum game, but over time, it is not. It's actually a positive-sum game. And corporations, of course, as economic actors, can maneuver among states. And in fact, Giovanni Arrighi has argued this is necessary. Of course, if we had had global government, we wouldn't have capitalism anymore. That in fact, the plethora and multiplicity of states and their various maneuver options is what engages capitalist activity. But the states are still important because they are the only entity which actually has or exhibits a social contract and ideally serves to maximize the welfare of its populations. And of course, this is at its most effective in democracies. So what do I mean by maneuver? Basically, what I mean is the ability to perceive, to learn, and to be able to reflect on one's position into the global economy, and then to create policies to enhance it. And of course, sometimes those policies don't enhance, depending on what they happen to be. And of course, these policies are usually treated as an interaction of economic and political activity. At the last point, interconnection among three democracies, what purpose would this serve? And there's several in terms of an evolutionary and realist perspective. One has been mentioned before. They can spread or share risks through joint fiscal policy, tariff reduction, and a variety of other instruments through the formation of trade agreements and even military alliances. They can provide a bulwark against regional conflicts, one of which is China. The other, which is also a potential, is Russia as well. And they can also mitigate critical resource flow variations through the creation of commodity quasi-monopolies. This becomes important later on when we talk about stability. So basically, we can see maneuver at two levels, one through actors and the other through states. The idea, of course, here is that states can change their position in the global economy at any particular time. And ideally, we want to be able to measure this. So, of course, if an alliance was formed, what are the criteria for the evaluation of success of an alliance? Say, we're interested in development and raising income levels or convergence across the participants. Or if it's some other criteria, we should be able to evaluate that as well. Perhaps movement of all three countries, improvement in their position in the global economy. So we're interested in these relative movements. And just to start off with convergence actually has a very specific meaning in terms of development economics. We think of the models of Barrow and Salah-Martin, and this is basically convergence, looking at income convergence in terms of a global average to evaluate success or improvement of countries through policy changes, redistribution of resources in that global economy. We can see just by looking at this table that actually convergence isn't tied to a global framework. It can be used in a regional framework. It's scalable. But there are also some problems that need to be pointed out. Actually, all of these show positive convergence. This is very optimistic. The world is, everything is getting better. There's no detriment anywhere. But part of this is an artifact of the estimation procedure, and this is something we should be aware of. So just as an example, I apply a new model and I create a global model of convergence using this, and we can see looking at the second line, this model also suggests convergence, 0.041. It's a decent model, produces the same kind of accounting for variability as the other models do. On the other hand, it doesn't conform with that model of an interacting global economy where states have unique experience. That is, the variation becomes important. And traditional approaches just don't take that into account. We're going to see that we need to be able to capture that kind of difference. So any evaluation of affiliation should take this into account. And what we do here is we use a weighting scheme, a spatial weighting scheme. This is an extraordinarily simple weighting scheme, just using proximity, assuming that countries form ties and dependencies with neighboring countries. We apply a kernel to this, and then use something similar to generalized least squares to estimate the components of variation. There's just a drawing of the kernel down at the bottom, and we get a very different result. This is actually an implicitly spatial model, and what we're doing now is we're using the same model structure, but we're applying it to countries and estimating locally based on neighborhood effects. So this is a kind of spatial kernel regression. And so we did this for 76 countries. Actually, if you look at the adjusted R-square and the AIC, this is a far better model than the previous model. That is, taking spatial effects into account, taking variation, the ability to allow countries to fluctuate in their behavior into account, produces a much better model. The problem, of course, is that we have 76 regression models, and how do we make sense of those? The way we make sense of those, and actually you can see by looking at this down at the minimum, this actually shows that not all countries, this isn't as optimistic. There's actually a number of countries that are diverging. Actually, India was one of them during the time period, but divergence isn't always bad. It actually can mean that you're moving away from the mean. Your growth is actually can be much greater than expected under the regional or global average. And we can plot convergence gradients using an interpolation procedure. In this case, we use thin plate splines to estimate the change in convergence. So we can actually generate a convergence surface. So this becomes one type of measure that allows us to incorporate variations into spatial variations. You can use any kind of spatial weight we want to evaluate a particular, say, type of affiliation. And we can constrain that way. This is another map using a discrete classification of country. This is a world system result. This is for 1990. And actually, it's a little hard to see, but we're seeing somewhat the same thing. One is discretized in terms of a classified hierarchy. The other is in terms of a continuous variable, which is convergence, which creates gradients over the surface of the planet. And in terms of these discrete classifications, what we're interested in terms of systemic change is what Dennis Quat at London School of Economics calls the creation of convergence clubs. That in fact, the hierarchies that we see, we can interpret as convergence clubs, that within each hierarchy, we actually have convergence towards a regional mean. So one measure of success might be movement or a change in the bifurcation structure within the global economy. In India, say, instead of being grouped in the semi-periphery, might be grouped over time in the core with Japan and the United States. And these bifurcation structures at their simplest level can be examined in terms of per capita income. The four diagrams on the right come from Qua's paper, and he used a very different method than I did when I was working with Christopher Chase Dunn and Salvatore Babones, and we obtained the same kind of tripartite structure, which roughly corresponds to core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And on the left, we can see what we mean by the creation of these bifurcation structures. The top diagram, of course, is just convergence to a global mean. This is the kind of thing that we would expect to see in a completely randomized global economy, which we do not have because there are both systemic effects and local effects. At the bottom, we see we have two separate stable points of bifurcation. This is what we would expect to find in a globalized economy where we have specific ties of interaction, but spatial variation tied to, or I should say regionalization. And we need a framework if we're going to measure these kinds of bifurcations. We need a framework, and that framework basically has to say that everything is interconnecting. The rate of change of movement or transition of countries, maneuverability of countries into one group or out of another group is going to be directly reflected in what happens in all of the other groups simultaneously. And if we're going to take some sort of probability or stochastic framework into account, we can model these differential rates of change as transition probabilities. And here's just one empirical example that allows us to look at four classes, say going from OPEC to periphery, semi-periphery, and core. Of course, we can have as many classes as we see to be statistically significant. And this is another type of measure that can be applied directly to some sort of affiliation. We can model the probabilities for any specific period of time, and we can look and see if these are stable over time. If they are stable over time, then the transition probabilities actually become a basis for prediction as well as description. This is actually just an example of a 30-year transition matrix, which is stable, which was used to predict 5 years into the future very, very successfully. So what we're looking at in this matrix, if we look along the diagonal, those are the probabilities of persistence within any particular class. The off diagonal on the upper part are actually downward movements, that is, devolution within the global economy, and on the lower triangular, those are upward movements in the global economy. So this actually becomes a way of looking at countries as they behave directly within a globally interacting system. And the nice thing, this is a description, but the nice thing is that we've actually found that we can model these using a game, using a BDY game, that actually the transition probabilities can be seen as the outcome of a very simple agent-based model that with finite resources. And I can answer any questions if anyone has an interest in that. And so this is a diagram, or actually these diagrams come out of Giovanni Arrighi's book. And to the right here, if we look at the top, we see two types of stability. We can measure the stability, the stationarity of that transition matrix. If it is stationary, we can confer stability. And what we would tend to find is we're looking at behavior between cycles of accumulation in either a Hicksian sense or in terms of the types of models that Braudel and Arrighi talk about. What we find is capitalist investment that is not strictly rent-seeking, but looking for infrastructure or social structure behavior that is actually going to create a threshold condition for a new cycle of accumulation, and that all takes place within essentially a profitability envelope. What we see to right of that is unstable investment, which is strictly rent-seeking and capitalistic and does not necessarily build or reinforce structures. This is not characteristic of affiliation. And actually, this can create bifurcations in the system. And what we see below are the kinds of bifurcations that Arrighi is talking about historically over time. And of course, critical resources or availability of critical resources can also influence this. I'm at time. Well, why don't I just stop? I'll just stop there. If there's any questions.
Questions, comments?
Okay. Sir, question?
Would you consider, consider the impact of evolution in Europe on your models?
There, actually, Button and Pentecost have built specific performance models for Europe. They did not include, in fact, we used the model that we adapted their model. Where is it? They did not build a spatial component in, and actually space, by building space into the model, has a significant impact on the outcome, because there's actually very strong economic, especially now with the free flow of factors of production. In Europe, we actually see a high degree of integration. You cannot treat any country, or even subunits of country, whether you're talking about nuts 1 or down to nuts 3, you can't treat them as independent. You get a very different result if you do perform a convergence as treating these as independent countries or treating them as spatial. I've actually done that. I didn't bring it with me, but the audit covariance for Europe is very high because of that intercommunication. And, but I actually haven't seen any new papers that actually build spatial effects into those models. I don't know, does that answer your question? Anything else?
At all?
At all?
So we move over to the next speaker. Professor Naoki Wakabayashi.
Good afternoon. So I'm very proud to be here, and thank you for your invitation from Professor Gargamel. And so in the first talks, the professor does describe the importance of the management of the alliances. But I want to talk about how to motivate academia have alliance, especially international alliance. So today, I would like to talk about how Japanese new TLO or the policy for the industry and academia alliance promotes the network growth of the industry and academia alliances and have an influence of the internationalization, especially in the biotechnology areas in the cluster. And so it may show the trigger of this new kind of international alliances. So as you know, that the biotechnology industry is expected as a new engine of the regional economic development. And so, so regional industry districts of the biotechnology, so-called bioclusters, have one major future. And so that is innovation in cluster may be made based on the research networks of farms, incubators, and entrepreneurs, also the researchers. And so we should pay much attention to the whole network structure of that kind of the researchers and university and also the research institute. So I want to advance this story as talks in the following content. So the first, the question and the framework, and the second is I want to describe the Japanese context of the biotechnology cluster, and third, and so I want to give some outputs of my research on the bioclusters, and so I move to the final discussion. And because in my area is macro-organizational behavior, it's mainly focusing on the dynamics of the inter-organizational networks. So in my area, and also in the policy science area, I think there's one growing topics, and so there's a big topics of how international organization, industry, and academic alliance networks grew in the bioclusters, and how we can stimulate this growth by the policy. And especially the TLO policy, or I want to talk about the very broad TLO policy, as a technology license policy. It may accelerate the formation of the alliance networks among the industry and academia, and also the venture companies, and also maybe internationalization. And I want to show that very small fact that after 2004, new Japanese TL policy pushing the growth of the industry academia alliance, and they are rising. So how TL? So this leads to that question: how TL policy changes facilitates the formation of the industry academia alliance networks and their internationalization. And so before I show my results of my research, I would talk about my research frameworks and the 3 points. First, I'm now interested in the impact of the policy of this policy for the industry and academia alliances, and so how these policies create a network or stimulate the growth of the networks. And so, second is, I take a social capital perspective, and so as the professor does describe that the social exchange is very important in the alliance. So I want to widen this perspective to the more whole network perspective. So now we have the very good technology tools, and so I call that the emerging longitudinal analysis perspective. That means that how network grew from time to time, and during the certain time, so how networks evolve or emerging. And so that is a very typical example of the research. So in San Diego, just 30 years ago, there's a very few, very small networks of the managers between the bioventure company, and afterwards, 30 years, and so this grows to the very big networks in the bioventures. So another problem is a very important question. How we can stimulate the internationalization of the alliance networks, especially in the industry and academia alliances. And so my ideas comes from actually the efforts of that one Californian cluster organization. So the name is the Global Connect, San Diego, California, and they are promoting that international networking among the bioclusters, and they are selling that. And some scholars stories that. And in Cambridge or in Boston, they have some advantages because they can easily internationalize alliance networks, because Boston or Cambridge can provide some seeds of the internationalization. So now the many researchers are focusing on the internationalization effects of the regional clusters. So I will talk about our clusters, or the Kansai cluster we call it in Japan. So our cluster has such an effect. And so this is my homework from the Galton Lake. So I should talk about the triangles. and so you know that's between the Japan and the United States, and so we have some kind of development international alliances, especially for the cutting edge drug research, and for example, the anti-cancer drugs or like that. So and now between the US and the EU, US, EU, and India, so there is a growing alliances, especially for the generic drug research. But problem is here, I think between India and Japan, less development of the alliances, because we have a very strong linkage with Professor Dalton, but nationally, it is a very small alliance, small number of alliances. So I want to summarize my theoretical framework here in 4 points. And so I want to describe that my research context, or the Japanese context of the biotech clusters, and so in 3 points. And first, you know that in Japan we face a very weak entrepreneurship, and government TLO policy or government institutional policy want to push more entrepreneurship in Japanese society. And so from the beginning of the 2000s, and government provided several policies pushing that more interface between the industry and academia, and more venturing from the academia. So and so we saw that the very broad policy change in this area. So firstly, in the 2004, as the government is a partial privatization of the national universities, mainly focusing on the large research national university, and other is that government set up the new IPO policy, and so the intellectual property from the research output moved from the professors to the university. So university can earn some money from the professor's research now. And so third point is that there is a big promotion of the industry and academia alliances. And so there is a rapid increase of the alliance from the university. So these graphs show that some results, and in all areas, and joint research and licensing between the industry and academia are growing up. And also, even in the life science area, joint research number of joint research is double. And so I want to show the advertisement of our area. So I want to show that Kansai biotechnology clusters. And so this area is our area. It's one of the biggest biotechnology clusters. And very few people know that. And so this area includes 200 pharmaceutical company and 36 university and 40 institutes, and the main industry is pharmaceutical, drug and food and medical equipment. And so government set up that national development programs, as we call the Kansai Bio Cluster Development Program in 2000. And here is this is Japan, and here is the area and the bioclusters. It's a very broad and very wide biocluster area. So we have actually we have 9 subclusters in this wide cluster. So our area is one of the part of them, but Kobe has a very largest clusters here. So there is 3 main players: the drug company and universities and the governmental research institute. So and I want to examine the 3 points. And so yes, because of the policy pushing. So there is an increase of the academic and industry alliance in our area. So, and academia become now taking the central position in the research around networks now. And there is the effect of the new TL policy for these alliance formation. And so TL policies may promote some kind of internationalization. And so actually I used the data of the patenting and based on the Japanese patent agencies. And so I selected that 903 organizations with around the 1,400 joint patents during the 8 years, 2002 to 2008. I want to divide the 2 periods, and I want to compare the change in the 2 periods, before and after the 2004. And this is the whole networks in the first period, before 2003. And so there is a yellow dots, and this means that very big national university, including our Kyoto University, but there is very few linkage around here. That's because of the TL policy impact, and it's around the yellow dot area, and so there are many linkages with companies, and so we can see that some policy impact on that joint patenting networks and growth of the joint patenting networks. So, and actually the number of the linkage has a rapid increase and quickly increase. And so I want to focus on that the core, our main player of these networks. And in the first period, it's from the 2000 to the 2003. This is the first period before the impact of that policy. And especially in the Joint Patent Alliance network, I think there is a big dominance of the business companies, especially mainly that pharmaceutical companies, Daihon, Sumitomo, and Shionogi. It's a very big, internationally, it's not so famous, but very famous in Japan. So big pharmas in Japan take a central position here. And here is our university, and very few linkage. Also, so this is Osaka University, very few linkage. But after the policy impact, so and Osaka University is now taking the central position now and have many linkages here, and also Kyoto University. And so this is another statistics, and I used the Bonacci centrality. It means that some centrality of between organization. And so in the first period, the top 10 ranking of the centrality mainly so from the number 1 to the number 10, such firms take the positions. But the second period, after the policy impact, I think the Kobe University, Osaka University, and Okayama University take a good position in the ranking. So I think that there is a kind of the policy impact. However, that is a very big point. I think that I show that the submission data, so but not the registration. So I want to say that yes, your universities are now increasing, increasing the number of the submission, but the failure rate is very high. So that is a professor problem. So so I want to say that there is a happy coupling between the big farmers and the university here. And I want to move to that's a very important agendas today. So yes, TL policy changes may increase alliance between university and foreign partners, especially drug companies and US and EU firms. And so yes, and in the first period, the universities do not have any linkage with global partners. But in the second period, I think there's a big increase. And so this is the average number. So, but if you compare the average number of that linkages between that university and the Japanese firms, I think that now the universities university has a higher number of that linkage now than the private company now. So I want to move to the discussion, a final discussion. Yes, based on our analysis after 2004, and there is a growth of the industry academia alliance networks in our area, so there may be a TLO policy impact. And the internationalization effects, there may be, but it's very small. So I want to stress that the national research funds set up the new evaluation standard for the new research project. So I want to say that so give a good incentive to increase the cross-border alliance between the national universities and especially Asian company and Indian company, and to create the reasonable and the very innovative drugs for the many diseases in the Asian area. That's it. So thank you for it.
Question, comments?
I have, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to address my argument to the domestic TOL or technology transfer office of the universities. The other one is for internationalization. The second, internationalization, I think that's a good idea and should be promoted. But for the domestic issue, the Japanese industry academy collaboration is primarily between national universities and then big business. But there are many other local or private universities which are really trying to or struggling to develop the technologies. And Japanese government policies are a little bit, has to be redirected to encourage small universities or private universities to develop their own technology, which could be enhanced by the private companies. For instance, even for national universities, the problem is that they do not necessarily have the strong supporting services by the university's Office of License Applications and Evaluation and so on and so forth. That is one of the big problems for the Japanese universities to enhance the patent or technology transfer. The second one is that, again, the government efforts are primarily on national universities. even with very few number of universities, such as Tokyo University, Kyoto, Osaka, Nagoya, to some extent, Tohoku and Hokkaido. That should be changed. For instance, in Kyoto, Kansai area, Kyoto is leading a particular bio area, but you also have Ritsumeikan and Ryukoku universities. These guys are not traditionally entrepreneurial type of the university, but they are really coming up with entrepreneurship. So I really hope you could help Japan in that area. And the internationalization, from Japan, most of the people look at the West Coast, Silicon Valley. People talk about Silicon Valley. But very few people talk about the East Coast, particularly this greater Washington, D.C. area, which I myself call the hub of entrepreneurship and innovation, because the government, federal government is located here. We have the NIH, which is a hub for biotech or life science. We have DOD or DARPA, which created or developed the internet. So that means Japan has to take a look at the other side of this continent, rather than West Coast, but more to East Coast.
East Coast.
So, okay, anyway, this is my observations. I appreciate if you say something about that.
I think so. I may get good comments for my research. And so actually I am talking about talking about the context of the biotechnology area. So I think you are talking about mainly the electronic industry or electric engineering or the machinery industry. Yes, in these areas, I think our Kyoto University and also the Osaka University, the big national university in our area, has less alliances with local companies, and so do not contribute to the local companies. But I think that this is a very typical problem in the biotechnology research. I think the big universities and also the big farmers and also that some high-tech venture companies can contribute to the advance of this research area. So I should divide these two types of programs, TLO, the general programs, and the TLO in the biotech area. And I think this is a very good topic. And so I think that Kyoto and Osaka University people want to have international alliances, especially with the European and US big farmers, because they provide a lot of the money for the drug research, especially the anti-cancer drug research in the Asian area. So, and so this is a very controversial situation comparing to the machinery industries. Yeah.
My question refers to the fact you talked about alliances between in this biotech area between Japan and US and India. My own personal experience from what I know recently is the fact that there doesn't seem to be much alliance between India and Japan. More like big pharma is buying up a lot of Indian firms. They're doing collaborative research. They bought Wipro, the largest, and small companies and big companies, personally I know, are being bought up. Though there is a lot of complementarities, seems to be no alliance. Is there any reason for that?
Yeah. As you say, that now the many big Japanese pharma are now starting that international alliance with Indian companies, as you said, and also that many newspapers are talking about these things. But I think starting date is a bit later than the United States and also European EU companies. So, and so we are now starting. I think many Japanese companies are now starting to have more alliances with the Indian and also the other Asian companies. Yeah, And so, yes, this is a very kind of the sense problem. So, how to feel that news. And so, in Japan, I think that many pharmaceutical people think that yes, international alliance with India is we do not develop that international alliance with the Indian company, not so much. I think that compared to the United States case and the UK, so we want to catch up. But as you say, that we should check that more statics of the alliance numbers. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So thank you very much. But very briefly, because we have exceeded the time limit. Very
Okay,
briefly.
sure. Yeah. So I'd like to ask you, to clarify what is attractive, of Indian pharma business or Indian bio business industries. I mean, one is accessibility to U.S. market for basic engineering resources, human resources, or so. What is good for Japanese to have a collaboration with India?
I think the mega volume market in Asia. I think mega volume market in Asia. And for example, I heard the very big news of in this very rabies. It's how can I say that's in Japanese kyokenbyo. And the rabies is a kind of the disease from dogs and but one national university researcher in Japan now developing that good treatment for that rabies. But in Japan, there's no patients of rabies actually. That's point. But not only in India, some Asian areas, the rabies are still very strong strong disease in these areas. We should provide such treatment methodology for that in Asian area. So I want to stress that again, that the attraction is the mega volume of the Asian market. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.